Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. I'm Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. Since 2015, the McFarland Center has led a research initiative called Catholics and Cultures, whose goal is to transform what Catholics know about and bring a global perspective to how we study and teach about Catholicism. The centerpiece of the initiative is a website called catholicsandcultures.org, which explores Catholic life and practice in particular countries and cultures around the world. We also publish an electronic journal, the Journal of Global Catholicism, and host international conferences that highlight the work of scholars who are focused on diverse forms of Catholicism around the globe. That task has taken me to some 30 countries so far, some places pretty remarkable I never thought I would see, and places that have really intrigued me, among them a couple of places in Micronesia, Chuk and Yap. One of the scholars when I was in Micronesia, whose work most impressed me in helping me to understand the situation, is in fact here with us today, so I'm really glad to introduce her. Juliana Flinn is an anthropologist whose work I discovered and frequently referenced during my trips to the Federated State of Micronesia, particularly around Chuk. She was in the outer islands, a little bit different place than I was visiting, but I found it especially helpful to read her work. Her book, called Mary, the Devil, and Tarot, Catholicism and Women's Work in a Micronesian Society, was an invaluable resource on the lives, and especially the gender roles, of Catholics on Pulap, an outer island in the Chuk state of Micronesia, in the Micronesian state of Chuk. Julie first visited Micronesia as a Peace Corps volunteer and has continued her research as a professor of anthropology and gender studies at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock, where she's taught for 30 years. I was also pleased to find out a couple of weeks ago after I invited her, that she has an old Holy Cross connection, and maybe she'll say a little bit more about that. But sometimes you invite someone from far away and you never know that there's a particular warm feeling for Holy Cross in someone's heart. So she spent some time in the archives today following up on that. Her scholarly research interests focus on cultural identity, kinship, gender, migration, and dance, and her teaching interests include cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and ethnographic methods. She's conducted fieldwork in the United States, exploring traditional American dance, and in the early 2000s taught a year in Grodno, Belarus, where she collaborated on research comparing Belarusian and American notions of home. Today, Professor Flynn is going to share with us how women practice, interpret, and shape Catholicism on Pulap, and how their image of Mary places value on indigenous notions of mothers and as producers and protectors. So please join me in welcoming Juliana Flinn.
My grandfather, Richard Flynn, graduated in 1908 and was given an honorary Master of Arts in 1915. And the archives had all kinds of cool photos, so I was excited. And you may wonder what on earth this picture has to do with Catholicism, but you will find out. I'm going to take you to a tiny tropical island in the South Pacific called Pulap. The islanders were converted to Catholicism in the late 1940s. From my perspective, that was not very long ago. But today, Catholicism is a very integral part of their identity. I'm going to show you a number of pictures, and I just want to note that their standards of modesty are different than ours, so just accept that, please. I'm going to give you a peek to start at the way they celebrate the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Okay, they are carrying whole plants of taro. It's a starchy food. The part you eat grows under the ground. It's like a potato. And they're hauling it down the aisle around the sides as the procession that opens up Mass. And the Mass was very solemn, and I'll talk about that later on. But afterwards, outside the church, the tone changed quite a bit. Those are the taro plants. And now they're joking and teasing each other, and it's a mock battle that's going on here. Okay. None of that matches at all the Feast of the Immaculate Conception that I grew up with. Not at all. If I had known it was December 8th, I would not have known. But I got very intrigued with it all because I found that in looking at the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a number of threads got woven together for me. One of them was a thread having to do with women's work. Here's a couple of the taro plants there. Women are responsible for producing and taking care of children, yes, but they're also responsible for producing and distributing the primary staple food on the island. This in part defines them as mothers. Another thread was looking at the role of Mary in their lives and how they saw her. She was a mother, and she was also an active foe of Satan. She's the one who stepped on the head of the devil. Another thread had to do with the relative roles of the church and tradition in the introduced municipal government, and the impact that it had on possibilities for women. I was also intrigued with looking at opportunities for self-expression and for having influence on the island. Opportunities to be heard, to make decisions. And I was interested, one of these other threads was how women enact motherhood, being a woman. It's not something that you are, it's something that you do. And I argued that this feast of the Immaculate Conception in many ways celebrates womanhood on the island and in an empowering way. I will argue that I was a bit surprised, to be honest, to find this sort of image of Mary, because a lot of the anthropological work I'd looked at talked about a decline in women's status when people were converted to Christianity and to Catholicism, that they were confined to the home and whatnot. So I was initially quite surprised and a little bit dubious. But I found that they have a very special image of Mary that does play an empowering role and a role model for women as the family breadwinners. She may have been brought to the island from the outside, but local people have made her their own. I assume that's part of what the Global Catholicism Initiative is about, that nobody is just passive recipients of church teachings, that they make the religion their own and it occurs in a particular cultural context. And part of the context here is understanding Mary as a mother, but Pulap's notions of what it means to be a motherhood. It's not just this biological process where you produce and then you take care of children, but it's a cultural one that encompasses this production and distribution of the staple foods, and also making essential goods such as mats that have practical as well as symbolic value. And their Feast of the Immaculate Conception is also grounded in an interpretation of a passage from Genesis. You all may know way more about this theology than I do, but the Pulapis talk about the passage where God tells the serpent, Satan, "She shall crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for her heel," she having been interpreted as Mary. And when the Pulapis talk about the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, that's the image that they talk about, and this is the statue of Mary that they say epitomizes for them the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. I looked it up, and it's Our Lady of Grace. The official Immaculate Conception statue is something else, but this is the one that has Mary stepping on the head of Satan, a very powerful image. So this talk is very much about how these women define their own Catholicism, how they live it in practice, and at the end I want to talk about how it affects their autonomy, their ability to shape their lives, to support their kin, and to influence community events, and including the behavior of men. A little bit about the setting. This is Pulap from the south. Micronesia means tiny islands. Pulap is a third of a square mile in area, which is not atypical at all. These islands just need to be large enough for a lens of fresh water to be sitting in the ground on top of the brackish salt water, because there you can grow several kinds of taro in a swampy interior part. Tom already mentioned that it's part of the Federated States of Micronesia. There's the state of Chuuk and these are the western islands, and Pulap was the one that I was on. The settlement area is most of it at the southern, more sheltered end, running up both sides. The taro swamp in the middle. The church is one of these main buildings in the center. There's a shrine to Mary up there called Fatima, which I will talk about. They are a matrilineal, matrilocal people. I won't go into the details of kinship, but descent is traced through women, and when couples marry, the husbands move in with their wives. Women cross-culturally tend to be better off this way. They're living with a core of women that they're related to and get along with better than if they were living with a number of sisters-in-law. That's a place full of abundant marine resources. The main job of men is to pull in the fish, though women will also hunt for octopus. So if they have a brother or a husband who isn't bringing in fish, they can at least provide some protein. In addition to taro that's grown in the swampy area, they subsist on other foods, including bananas, including breadfruit. It's the green things, if any of you have never seen breadfruit. Though it's tiny and peripheral, it's never really been isolated from the rest of the world. There's a long heritage of inter-island ties and canoe voyages that connected islands. The ocean out there is not a barrier, it is a road connecting islands with each other. There have been a series of colonial governments, and men sometimes were taken away to work. When Americans came in, they were promoting first elementary education, secondary education, eventually encouraging students to go to college. In the 70s, a lot of them started going to the United States. Today, there are a lot of islanders in places like Guam and Hawaii, but also coming to the mainland. The political status, starting in the 1980s, has allowed them to come in readily, and here are some living in Corsicana, Texas. Okay? So even though it's a subsistence-oriented on the island, they're connected in a variety of ways to the outside world, including through Catholicism. At the same time, they are very, very proud of being traditional. Right? They still show a lot of deference to kin. There's special patterns, for example, that women show towards brothers. They still retain navigational knowledge. There's traditional dancing, weaving, a commitment to kin rather than to individualism. They recently revived an initiation ceremony for navigators. So they're very proud of the role of tradition, but at the same time being Catholic. And they see Catholicism as another force that's guiding their lives. It's not supposed to conflict with tradition. Right? And a lot of activities involving going to church are woven into everyday life. They do not have a resident priest, but they have lay leaders that regularly have services every day, rosary every afternoon. Now, the four major feasts are Easter, Christmas, New Year's, and the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And even though nobody there would say that it was more important than any of the other feasts, but it was the one that I heard talked about the most. And I was told that the celebrations involving these taro plants that you saw them hauling around, I was told that that was started in the early 1950s, soon after they were converted, and that it paralleled earlier rituals involving food offerings to spirits. The idea was to bring your biggest and your best. It might be coconuts, it might be taro like this, and they believe that Mary furnishes them with taro. And there's a special kind that I'll get into later on, this whiter kind of taro. The earlier years, I'm told it was a very open competition, a contest with prizes for the women that managed to produce the biggest taro. The bigger the taro, the more the woman's worth was demonstrated and the bigger honor it was to marry. It was scaled back a bit, I was told, around the 60s into the 70s, maybe even a little later. They were concerned about the abundant production, and maybe it was too much food that they were producing for a feast. But a typhoon hit the island in 1990, and they decided, since Mary's supposed to protect them from storms, might be a good idea to revert back to the older ceremonies, to produce more taro and have more offerings to honor Mary, so she would continue to take good care of them. And the women said that they even wanted to make an offering of the hard work that goes into making the taro. They didn't want the chiefly clan worried about the work that they were going to put into it. And months ahead of time, they were cultivating this taro, getting ready for December 8th. And it involves mulching and fertilizing, a lot more work than other kinds of food. They were planning the church event for weeks in advance, the details for the feast, activities for entertainment. The year these pictures are from, the entertainment was going to consist of songs and skits, and it was going to be organized by various church groups that women were members of. So again, there was a lot of time practicing these songs, practicing these skits. And I noticed that even in the planning for this, women were listened to. It was the parish council that made a lot of these decisions, and women are on the parish council. And it wasn't just that they could attend. I noticed that people paid attention to what they said. One of the big decisions they made was recommended by a woman. For example, instead of individual women making contributions to the feast, she suggested it be by household, lessening the burden a little bit. And that if they could, it would be nice to provide the special taro, but that they didn't have to. So some key economic things being shaped by a woman in connection with this. On December 6th, there was a community meeting, and the women started sort of a teasing and a taunting song aimed at the men there, pushing for them to provide a certain kind of fish that they wanted. And I'm told men don't ignore these things. Interestingly enough, December 7th was very stormy and cloudy, and it prevented good fishing. I'm going to talk about how later on that got reframed as there was not enough fish because the men were drinking. This is the way women had of having some control. But anyway, this did not put a damper on any of the things that women were doing. This was like a party. They were going around the meeting house, singing, taunting, mostly led by women in their 40s and their 50s. They were carrying machete, waving flags. They went down a path singing, and there was a competitive spirit. As I said, they were lined up according to 3 different church groups. One of the songs had to do with open up your bag. We will see how meaty is the taro. Whose is it? The one belonging to that group, it's all dried out. There were references to women's strength. The fire cannot be put out. That is how strong we are, as strong as fire that cannot be put out. Outside the taro gardens, there was a little bit of a pause. They wore baskets to carry the taro in. They changed into pants. Men are not supposed to see them in pants. Men were sort of banned from this part of it. And then they went out and they harvested their taro. And I don't have any video of this. I wish I had. A woman might pick up a taro and she would yell, "Why-yo!" because she had this real big, huge taro. Or pakutong, which means dynamite. All right? You know, that I got a real big taro, okay? And then they were lined up side by side. And it was a bit competitive. They weren't really choosing who had the biggest one, but, you know, these are really good pieces of taro that they've got, okay? Then they all went home, and they got ready for December 8th, and the taro was laid outside the church as the offerings to Mary. And these were the ones that you saw them carrying into the church and then bringing out again afterwards and kind of thrusting them at each other. For the ceremony, it was expected, if you could, to wear blue, Mary's color, though other ones were acceptable. The statue of Mary was all decorated with taro stems and leaves. You saw the opening procession with taro. And women played unusually prominent roles in the service. They brought extra taro during the offertory section. And also, I was intrigued with the prayers of the faithful section. Normally, a man does those, and it's a simple little, these are the requests that we have. But they had several, a prayer of apology, of thanks, and of request that women compose themselves. And this is a place where oratory is valued. It's an art form. And so this was a chance for women to show that off without being arrogant, because this was an acceptable way of doing it. These very eloquent prayers that they said. As I said, the very dignified tone of the service changed as soon as they left the church. They had all that teasing and taunting. They went home to take care of the feast. There was food. There are usually speeches given, and women could do some of those speeches. And then they had the song competition and skits. One of the skits contrasted a good woman with a bad one, the bad woman refusing to provide food for the sick one. This sounds all very serious, but the women who did it mined it for all the humor you could possibly have, and people had, again, another way of showing artistry. Another one of the skits told the story of Adam and Eve, followed by Mary stepping on the head of the serpent. So, in sum, their image of Mary is one of a mother, and you can see this in the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, as the provider of food, the staple food. She helps ensure a good taro harvest, a victor over temptation, the woman who stepped on the head of the serpent, and a protector from storms. She's a role model for women there that I see is a fairly strong model, role of mother as a provider who's taking care of the physical needs and the emotional well-being of her kin and the rest of the community. I mentioned that another one of these threads involved in the Feast of Immaculate Conception has to do with women's work, because what it means to be a mother is revealed through women's work, right? Now, they have an ideology in the island that women are associated with the land, men with the sea, women garden, men fish, women provide stability, men mobility. But I kind of wanted to do a more systematic analysis of how they saw their work. So one of the things that I did was I just went around and asked a lot of women to tell me what was women's work. And I looked at what was said most often and early in people's lists. And the most salient item when you asked what should women do was work in the taro gardens. And the second most salient item was to weave these mats. Taking care of children did not come up very high on that list of responsibilities. I'd argue in part that it's just not seen as a separate activity. You know, making mats is taking care of your children. Growing taro is taking care of your children. And certainly babysitting children is not the work of healthy adult women. Okay. Another way to get at things a little bit systematically was to ask women to sort these tasks for me into things that were similar and things that were different. And I made the computer spit me out a pretty little map that's way more complicated than you want to deal with. But the general idea is that if more people said they were similar, they're closer together. Things that are farther apart were seen as most different. So there's one little cluster of here that's connected with making mats, making baskets, weaving cloth, things that you do with your hands. Okay. And weaving, making these mats is something a lot of other people in Chuk no longer do. So one, they're very proud that they've retained this tradition, but it has practical as well as symbolic value. Giving these things to people, giving them to the kin, your kin, is a way that you show that you care. At the opposite end of this diagram, very different things, about as different from doing things with your hands as you can get. Mediating disputes, being strong in religion, showing respect for your brothers, and advise or counsel or talk in order to guide people, was seen as a very different set of things women are responsible for. Another kind of set here is the taking care of people, taking care of the sick, taking care of the children, caring for the elderly. Another cluster here is out in the woods kind of stuff, going out to the garden, hauling leaves out there, making copra, and then feeding people kind of right there in the middle, the purple stuff there in the middle. Okay? So in short, women's work has to do with cultivating and preparing the staple foods, making these mats, these essential material goods, taking care of the sick and the elderly, and maintaining respectful and harmonious relationship. That sort of sums up the respect for people and counseling and guiding people. Their work is also seen as essential to a lot of the work that the men do. The men are the ones that usually go in the canoes, but women provide the food for those canoe voyages, and women make the panels for the sides of houses and the roofs, and the men are the ones that will climb up and put them on there. So taking care of people in a variety of dimensions is the essence of women's work, the sort of nurturing that they do. And for them, Mary is the ultimate nurturing figure. But it requires the cultivation of tarot in order to be able to do that nurturing. That this is the most salient aspect of women's work, and it provides a foundation for all the other kinds of nurturing. So it would make sense for them that tarot would be the appropriate offering to Mary. Anybody who's been out of Micronesia, this probably applies to a lot of places in the world, food is related to relationships among people and with land. For example, in Micronesia, you have to have one of these staple foods to have a meal. All right, fish by itself is okay, but it's not a meal. Coconut's nice, but it's not a meal. You have to have one of these staple foods culturally to have a meal. And giving food communicates things like kinship and respect, strength of character, generosity. It can shape the reputation of people, even of an island. There's a common kind of tarot, often called swamp tarot. It's actually the kind I preferred, and this is it. But the most prestigious and the valued tarot, tarot, that's the one that's involved in the offerings to Mary. This is, if you want to honor somebody, that's the kind of tarot you give. Even if you know they prefer something else, you give this kind of tarot. It's less common. It's more work. It doesn't stay as long in the ground. It's more vulnerable to rain. It's the one that is seen as taking strength to cultivate. Right? While I was there, the week was divided up into days appropriate for different activities. Monday, Wednesday, Friday was garden work, though they worked nearly every day leading up to December 8th. They believe that giving the tarot to Mary puts them in a favorable position, that she will help to protect them from storms as well as the cultivation of tarot. I showed you that little shrine at the end of the island. That's where they believe storms come from, and there's a little statue in her honor there. And giving the tarot is a way that women are showing that they want to follow in her footsteps. So I wanted to look at the impact of these beliefs about Mary on women's autonomy. And I was interested in looking at the three domains that they see as governing their lives, religion being one of them. And because the role of women and their possibilities are different in each one of them. Very briefly, one of those is the role of tradition. And in terms of structures, there's an island chief, and there's a council of elders, and it's always men. And women aren't supposed to speak up publicly. They're allowed to talk if they're asked to talk. It's fairly customary to ask, and it's more likely to be older women. But in this realm of tradition, there are ways for women to have influence. And I would argue that Catholicism sort of enhances this a little bit. First of all, older women are seen as repository of special kinds of knowledge, especially knowledge about land, right? So that gives them some status. They have influence over junior men, whether it be sons or nephews. And so they're expected to advise them, to counsel them, to guide them. They can very quietly go to senior men in their own clan or to people in their father's clan. They can do some of those teasing, taunting songs publicly. I was really intrigued looking at strategies that they had to try and change the drinking regulations. There's a real tug of war on the island. Men wanted to be able to drink, and women didn't like it. So first of all, they were able to reframe the bad weather on December 7th, leading to bad fish as being that the men were drunk. And that's why there wasn't very much fish. There were family problems. There would be gossip about drinking causing them. If they had to avoid dancing practice, they would say, oh, we're afraid of what the men might do. Bible study. Bible study is valued. So if they were gossiping about how they couldn't do Bible study because they were afraid of drinking, that could have an impact. As long as what the women were pushing for was culturally valued, and in this case, harmony in the community, or promoting religious things like Bible study, or preparing skits or dancing for one of these celebrations, or having good fish to honor Mary with, then it was really hard for men to turn them down. Women are also able to use a very soft and polite style, and if they're quiet and persistent, there's belief that the power of the language is eventually going to have people give in and say yes. Another way that they have influence in this realm of tradition is the role really as household managers. They organize the daily work of what's going to happen in the household, including whether or not they need fish or a particular kind of fish. The domain of government, and they often use the word government, is a municipal system brought in by the Americans. And Tuesday is Municipality Day. They all meet in this meeting house. All able-bodied men and women are expected to come. The council is expected to be entirely men, but women can speak up at these public meetings, but it's more expected that men are going to do it. I did not, except for women voting for the council members, I didn't see much room for women to have influence in this particular domain. And Tuesday was Municipality Day. Thursday was a day for the women's church groups to get together. And even though women do not hold the lay leadership in the church leading services and whatnot, they are members of the parish council. And this council makes decisions about things like money and food and mats. And it's the only formal governing body that does include women. So it gives them public roles, and I argue opportunities for self-expression. It's not supposed to be in conflict with tradition, but they talk so much about it, I got the sense that it's something they need to work on. One of the ways that I found that they wove church and tradition together is the way they talked about their conversion. It's almost as though Catholicism strengthened Pulap's tradition in terms of things like being generous, being kind, taking care of people that need help, respect for rank. And Catholicism enabled them to abandon things like fighting with other islanders. I sort of saw it as having their cake and eating it too, that we are capable of this kind of fighting. We are strong enough to do this kind of fighting, and don't you forget it. But we have chosen not to do that anymore, that we're strong enough and virtuous enough that we're not going to do it. So it's not as though they were in the dark and all of a sudden saw the light. It's as though Catholicism enabled this traditional stuff to flourish and to get rid of some other stuff. All of the adults are members of one of these church groups. I mentioned to somebody that I had not anticipated studying religion when I went here this time, but if I wanted to do anything in the island, it involved doing these religious things. I mean, they had services every morning, they had rosary every afternoon, everybody was a member of a church group. The holy days This is the live Stations of the Cross, one of the most moving things I had ever seen. You know, they made a big deal about all of the holy days. There was not a priest resident on the island, so I was sort of intrigued. These are the kids getting ready for First Communion. There was one Mass with a whole series of baptisms, a whole series of First Communion, and then a number of couples were married. When they talked about community activities, they took place after church, they took place after Rosary, and nothing was supposed to interfere with that. It was really bad form to schedule something during Rosary. I want to finish talking about sort of constraints and opportunities that Catholicism has provided. It is hard to get out of a bad marriage now. Divorce was sort of free and easy before this era, and there are people who decide not to get married if they're not fairly sure that it's going to last. It's hard for them to limit their childbearing. A lot of them are having 14, 15 kids. It's taking a toll on their health. And there is more emphasis on obedience to husbands than there was in the past. On the other hand, there are a lot of opportunities to travel and to exchange ideas. This is a place where men travel with a reason, women travel with a reason, and men don't need one. But there's so many reasons now. Women going to various workshops to learn more about teachings of Catholicism and roles for women. So they're getting to meet and talk with women way more than they had a chance to in the past. It has opened up a lot of opportunities and scenarios for their obligations to advise for public speaking. This is a place where there's a lot of emphasis, not just on oratory, but the power of words. That if you have a chance to speak, that it's almost like there's power behind those words to get people to do things that you're talking about. And with Catholicism and Mary, they see it as an obligation that they have. That there's the Word of God, there's the Word of Jesus, there's the Word of Mary. And part of their responsibility is to help to spread the Word of Mary. And they believe Mary and Jesus both want the full participation of women to do this. And this happens in a variety of occasions. There are speeches at religious occasions. There are Bible discussions quite regularly. They take the statue of Mary once a week from one household to another with rosaries in both places, but there are all kinds of speeches at both houses. And they asked people to help. They use the word that means help. It's as though the people in the household have an obligation to speak up. And a lot of these speeches or these skits that they have at these religious events can be directed at men and articulate how men are supposed to behave. For example, there was one, we need to help those in need. If I'm in the taro gardens, I get thirsty. If I ask a man to climb a coconut tree to get me a coconut, will he listen to me? If I'm sick, will a man bring me coconuts? If you men can fish with a motorboat, will you help those without a motorboat? That you as men have obligations, and men cannot readily ignore these things. I was also intrigued with the skit that they had, which was purportedly about telling women to be patient, but it was at the same time criticizing male behavior that created the problem. It was a skit about a man leaving with his paycheck to buy some food, but instead he gets drunk, uses the money for alcohol, comes home asking for food, and the woman says there is none. And the moral of the story is women be patient, but the moral story also to the men was you shouldn't be out doing all of that drinking. A lot of these stories are also opportunities to reinforce the notion that everybody, but including women, have an obligation to speak up, to help, to advise, to counsel. You saw the far left of that stuff about responsibilities to advise. They say that's what Mary did, that Mary advised people. She counsels people. And I was intrigued, in particular, when women started talking about we also have obligations to talk to our brothers. The brother-sister relationship is one of very heightened respect. And in the realm of tradition, a woman would never tell her brother how to behave. She could tell a lot of other men how to behave, but not her brother. But they say, Mary wants us also to speak to our brothers, and they will value what it is that we have to say. So that's why I argue that Mary is a model of strength, physical strength, spiritual strength, and I would argue even this characteristic of patience, because it's so similar to the way I heard people talk about the Chiefly clan on the island. That the Chiefly clan is supposed to be like a rock on the reef, where the waves keep hitting and slapping and hitting, but the rock just stayed. So no matter how much people complain or want something or whine, you just stay patient. That's a kind of strength. So I don't see that as a weakness if they're saying the Chiefly clan is supposed to be like that. And Mary helps women be like that. She celebrated the Feast of the Assumption, Rosary every day, Mary's Month in May, the Rosary Month in October, where they go to the shrine of Fatima, where there's that statue. I mentioned that they carry a statue of Mary from one household to another every week. And there are ways there that women could have influence. If the statue is going to a place where there were men who, they weren't fishing the way they should, or they were getting drunk, or they were hitting their wife or something like that, there'd be gossip about that, saying, what's Mary going to think? We can't disrespect Mary that way. So there was this kind of pressure put on men to behave that way. Mary is approachable in ways similar to the ancestral spirits. They would have done things like this, offered flowers and the like for her. And in terms of history, I saw strong female figures in their past. There's a mother goddess who produced people and islands and plants, and one of her children was the high god. So a woman who gives birth to God fits nicely into their older beliefs. And I was also intrigued. One of the stories I was told over and over again on Pulap was how navigation came to the island. This is the part of the Pacific where navigation is alive and well. There was a bird who was going around eating all the people on these other islands. When the bird got to Pulap, there was a woman who was able to get a bowl of taro, a fish, and a coconut. You can see the bowl of taro, the fish, and the coconut, never ending. So no matter how much that bird ate or drank, there was always more. And the bird was so grateful, he taught her the secrets of navigation. So again, it was a woman who was given this stuff. That part of the story I never understood. She loaded him up with all that food, and so he drowned. And I thought, that's not very nice. He taught you the secrets of navigation. But it's not my story. When I got back, I was intrigued with looking at what feminists had to say about Mary. And I really think a lot of the way the Pulapis see her is what they were talking about, that the feminists are recommending a more powerful and more autonomous image of Mary, at least compared to the meek one that I grew up with. And someone who had elements of a goddess, who had feminine aspects of a divine being. Someone who's strong, someone who combines motherhood with an active public life as a disciple. So the message to women is to actively engage with issues. So if you think back to those early pictures that I showed you, I don't know, I think there's something wonderfully ironic about a place that is seemingly so backward, seemingly so peripheral, has a message about Mary that I think some of us should listen to. Thank you. Oh, I got to show one more slide. I don't know anything about PowerPoint. A wonderful work study put all of this together for me, including the videos. I told her what I wanted, but she put it all together. So I have to give her credit. They're losing land. They are worried about their taro. there's a specialist who's trying to find some versions of taro that will grow in salt water. They still think Mary's going to help them out. I think it came to be what it was in part because Mary is a mother, and their notions of a mother involve this cultivation. And I don't know exactly what role the catechist played that converted them, but I heard that he played a role in these competitions that started out about using taro as part of the offerings. So I think it was that combination of things, because part of it is just to them, a mother is not somebody that just takes care of kids. A mother grows that food, and that they would believe that she would help nurture that. So I think a combination of some of these older goddess figures, as well as this early catechist who promoted taro as the offering for Mary. And because when people who do gender studies, the idea is that if you produce and distribute key items, you retain a relatively high status. And what happened in too many places in the world, women were taken out of that into the home, and that didn't happen on Pulap. I don't know, that's about all I can answer in terms of who did it or how it happened, but I think some of it was just their cultural notions of motherhood. The resistance narratives were always earlier. I'd have to look at my notes, but earlier peoples who tried to convert them, who didn't behave the way they were telling other people to behave. And I've often wondered, well, why did it work with this man from the Mortlocks in the late 1940s? I think one of the reasons is they saw it to their advantage, that Catholicism would open up some doors. They saw it being opened up to other people. I think it helped that it was a man from the Mortlocks, and he ended up marrying locally so that he was trusted. I never heard resistance narratives. One of the things that I heard, not so much about women, but about accepting Catholicism. Apparently there were a lot of discussions about what's pagan that we have to abandon, but what's just tradition that we don't have to abandon. And the Chiefly clan played a big role in that. The Chiefly clan converted, and they, apparently the menstrual houses were deemed pagan, so they were gotten rid of. For a while, dancing was deemed pagan and gotten rid of, but it came back. And I did hear stories about the mother of the chief playing a role in loosening up on what was, we'll call this tradition rather than paganism.
And was there a priest here before, or have they always been, was it by boat? Was it the boat that just brought the priest in?
You probably know more than that than I. Yeah, there was a boat. Wasn't there one for the Western Islands for a while? And there was a resident one on Namanuido. There was one of the times when I was there was one that most of the time lived on a different island on Pulawat. But there wasn't any there the time that most of these photos are from. But there's one who would come by boat from time to time. He came there just the one time I was there, when we had all of those ceremonies all at one time. The lay people carry it on amazingly. In terms of speech, to be able to talk smoothly without those ums that I'm doing, to speak with self-confidence, I haven't explored all of the details, but there's something about, eloquence of words and the ability to tell stories, to tell vivid stories, depending upon the context, humor, to get people to laugh. I was amazed, this isn't quite answering your question, there was a Head Start graduation where you had all these 5-year-old kids, and each one got up on a table in front of the entire community and gave a little speech, about I'm in this clan and this is my father's clan. And we could not, I swear, we would not get 25-year-olds to do that in our society, but it's a part of the way that they're taught. So the ability to get up and do that fluently. But there's something about the eloquence in the words that they use and vivid stories to bring something to life.
Follow up on that. Does that extend to material culture agriculture, like making mats, or even harvesting taro?
Not in harvesting taro. With mats, the way you can decorate things. Historically, a lot of it was done with weaving their skirts, and it had to do with color combinations and certain patterns that they could make. And they had beaded belts, and it was the same thing. The mats, some of it's what I think of more as a craft. I had so much respect for these women and what they do, because everything I tried, I was just pitiful at, including this weaving that was all jagged. But to have it have a nice, even weaving, but there's artistry in a pattern that you would do around the side. For women, another way of showing artistry has to do with creating dances, songs about emotions concerning their relatives. A lot of them, one was about Lambert Locopoy and when he went off, something that his mother had composed. And then fluid movements that would be associated with the dancing. And that little skit that they had for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, again, somebody was chosen as Mary. But I don't recall anything about it being a big contest or the one who done the biggest tarot. It might just have been somebody willing to do it. There was a workshop on the island when I was there about birth control, and they were told how they could get access to it. And it was recommended that they talk to the priest, and the women, and if they gave to the priest an argument about their health, they were pretty confident that he would okay them using foam as a contraceptive. That's the one that they were most interested in. It's being relatively isolated, it would be a matter of making sure that it was brought out on the boat and available, and that's always iffy out there. But theoretically, they did have access to it. If they went and got it from the dispensary, everybody would know. So it was going to be really important for them to be able to talk to the priest. And he didn't come. The time he came was before that workshop, so I don't know what happened in the wake of that.
But it's legally accessible throughout Micronesia.
Yeah. They just knew that the church was against artificial methods of birth control. But they were concerned about baby after baby after baby. So, anything else?
Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
That's great.
That was great, thank you.